Welcome to the third module of the ICMAI awardees multimedia online resources devoted to Yves Chevallard and the anthropological theory of the didactic. This module deals with the notion of praxeology. I'd like to show you how it can be used as a tool of the didactic analysis. As explained in the introduction, the first 4 modules of the unit are related to a lecture given by Yves Chevallard in Osaka, Japan, in 2016. The notion of praxeology is presented there on pages 14 to 25. It appears as one of the main notions of the ATD, and it's a productive tool to describe human activities, including doing mathematics and also teaching and learning mathematics. So we will talk about mathematical praxeologies and also about didactic praxeologies. The notion of praxeology and its developments were elaborated in the 90s when I was doing my PhD under the supervision of Yves Chevallard. Here are 2 papers where it first appeared. They are in French and published in the journal Recherche en didactique des mathématiques. However, in the resource folder, you will find other papers in English that also introduce and use this notion. In the previous module about the didactic transposition process, we talked a lot about knowledge and about different types of knowledges, the learned and taught knowledge, and also the knowledge to be taught and the scholarly knowledge, 2 entities that are not usually considered in research in mathematics education. This type of knowledges live or exist in different institutions under different conditions, and they are also made of different ingredients or components. What are these elements? For instance, when we talk, as in the previous module, about the teaching of proportionality, we ask the question about what this piece of knowledge called proportionality is, what it is made of, what are its raisons d'etre, how it is used, how it is delimited, organized, related to other works. These questions have to be asked about the different steps of the didactic transposition process, that is, about the different types of knowledge that appear there. The main notion to analyze knowledge in the ATD is the notion of praxeology. It is assumed, and this is a basic postulate, that any human activity can be described in terms of praxeologies. This term is made of 2 Greek words, praxis and logos. Its main purpose is to show that all human activities include 2 dimensions that are inseparable, the more practical one and the more theoretical one. The praxis block contains 2 elements, type of tasks, the big T, and techniques, symbolized with the Greek letter tau. As Chevallard says in the lecture, any activity conducted in an institution splits into a number of basic parts called tasks. Every task is of a certain type, which is generally expressed by a verb of action with a direct object. Therefore, to make an omelette, to welcome a guest, to blow one's nose, to compose an opera, or to solve a probability problem are types of tasks. They make sense because they are institutional constructions. In a sense, type of tasks are always artificially or culturally determined. It is obvious that there are many different ways of making an omelette, welcoming a guest, blowing one's nose, and solving a math problem. So the type of task does not determine how tasks of the type are performed. We need another notion, the techniques. In the ATD, we use the term technique to refer to any way of doing a task of a given type. Be careful with the use of this term. A technique in the sense of the ATD does not mean that the way to perform the task is a routine or an algorithm, not even technical. There are techniques to compose an opera, to make a movie, or to paint a landscape. So we have to understand the term technique in a broad sense. Pay attention to the interdependency between techniques and tasks. A technique can be decomposed into a sequence of tasks, each of which can be performed using a technique, etc., etc. The selection of the smallest unit to describe tasks and techniques depends, of course, on the analyst's purposes and on the type of the problems addressed. Finally, even if a task can be performed using different techniques, we observe a kind of tendency in institutions to assign one main prevailing way of doing each type of task, with infinite tiny variants or modifications, of course. Think about the way of cooking an omelette in Spain, which is very different than in France or Japan. One would say that the concept of omelette is very different in these three countries. But you can learn how to make the omelette in the Spanish way, as if there was only one way to do it, with as many variants as cooks, anyway. And the same can be said about the proportionality problem. I present here three ways of doing that are different. Of course, they can be mathematically equivalent, but they are praxeologically different. They activate different objects, different notions, writings, words, assumptions. And they have different scopes, limitations, connections with other mathematical objects. Take the first one. This is a very well-known technique. We write the data on a table or something of the sort, establish an equation, which in fact is called a proportion, and then proceed with the so-called cross products. The second technique is known as the reduction to the unit. It's mainly done with words and some partial calculations. Usually the words are said orally, and the calculations are made on paper or on the calculator. The third technique is more unusual. It activates the notion and the writing of linear function in a way that is not common in current schools. It's a different technique, even if it leads to the same result. It can be also performed with words. For instance, saying that 14 pence are 12 pence plus 2 pence, so the price will be the price of 12 pence plus 2 pence, blah, blah, blah. This is an oral variant of the technique. You can think that this oral variant is more meaningful, or that seems to be more reasoning in it. But these are only value considerations that involve a specific and not neutral definitions of what meaning and what reasoning are. However, it is important for a technique to be intelligible, at least for the user. We have to complete thus the praxis block of a praxeology with its logos. The second block of praxeologies is the logos. The word logos means discourse in Greek. This block corresponds to a discursive environment of the praxis, a way to describe and justify it in order to make it more intelligible to others and also to oneself. There's another postulate of the ATD here. That is the fact that there exists no practice or praxis without a discourse to explain, describe, and justify what is done. To exist as a normalized activity, a praxis block or know-how is always accompanied by a discourse or logos about the praxis. So praxis always go with logos and then forming a praxeology. Sometimes the logos can be very incipient, limited to something like, why? Because this is the way we do it. It's always been like this. And it can also be a very developed logos, as in scientific theories, where any assumption is intended to be as explicit as possible. The aim of the logos, as we said, is to give intelligibility to the praxis. At least it provides a rough description of what is done and why it is done in such or such way. The logos is split in two main elements. The technology, indicated with the Greek letter theta, and the theory, with the same letter in capital letters. Technology corresponds to the first description of the praxis. Why the technique leads to carry out the task T, how reliable it is, why it is good to use it, etc. It is also the most explicit part of the logos, what is made more visible. When we talk about discourse, we have to understand it in an extended sense. It includes symbols, calculations, diagrams, etc. In the case of the techniques used to solve the probability problem, each of them can be described and justified using different technological elements, especially different ways of defining the proportionality between two quantities and the elements, the ingredients that are in the technique. In the first case, there is a main element there, which is proportions, and also an implicit common sense knowledge about products and price. If we double the number of pens, the price will double too. This is also part of the technology of the second technique. And then in the third technique, there is another technology based on the properties of linear functions. Let us move to the second element of the logos block, the theory. It comprises the main assumptions, notions, or other elements that are activated by the technology, and also by the technique. It also includes implicit ideas and beliefs that sustain the technology and the techniques. In most of the activities, this level is difficult to reach because precisely of its implicitness. For instance, we can describe how to prepare an omelette and provide the first reason of why. This is the technology. But the why of this why is not that obvious. In the example of pens and prices, we can explain that the technique used relies on the fact that pens are proportional to prices. But the hypothesis of proportionality is usually taken as a given, as obvious. This is thus part of the theory. In fact, it is implicitly assumed in the formulation of the task. I have just indicated here some elements of the theories that usually sustain the techniques and technologies that are taken as examples. A deeper analysis is necessary depending on where the type of task is performed, because praxeologies are not universally determined. So any variant can have some technological and also theoretical variants. In the first case, I have mentioned the definitions, properties, and main assumptions about quantities and ratios and proportions. The theory of the second technique is much more implicit and relies on a kind of social evidence of how a determined type of quantities covary. And finally, the third case relies on the notion of function and linearity. The role played by quantities in this universe is not always easy to unravel. In any case, the notion of functions in this third case makes it easy to pose the question of the hypothesis of proportionality, something that was implicit and assumed in the previous techniques. Here, linearity appears as one possible functional relationship among many others. So, an element of the theory that was an assumption in the first two cases that was implicit becomes here explicit and thus is more easily questionable. If we come back to our initial problem about what proportionality is and how to describe it, we can see that the notion of praxeology enables us to specify our questioning and provide some elements to make the description more precise. What types of tasks, what techniques, what technological discourse, what theoretical assumptions are there? And this kind of questioning should be repeated for all the steps of the didactic transposition process. This description can show some possible strength, but also gaps or inconsistencies that might explain why a given praxeological organization or a given amalgam of praxeologies exists in a given institution, what limitation it has, why some connections are not done while others are, etc. In particular, and this is maybe the most important strength of this type of analysis, it can show that some possible praxeological elements could exist as part of the knowledge to be taught or to the taught knowledge, but fail to exist. Let me just draw your attention to the fact that in the process of didactic transposition, the knowledge to be taught corresponds to praxeologies that are only named or pointed to, not really enacted, as in the other cases. Well, we have seen many new terms in this module. Some of them are also used in daily life, and that can create some confusion. To summarize, we can say that the logos block corresponds to what most people have in mind when they use the term knowledge. Also, as Chevallard says in the lecture, when one can reasonably argue that knowledge is the dialectical union of logos and praxis. In fact, the term theory is usually used as a metonymy to design the entire praxeology, but just referring to a part of it. Like when we talk about number theory or the theory of relativity, and also in the anthropological theory of the didactic. We talk about theory, but we mean a whole praxeology or even a set of praxeologies. Praxis is also used as a metonymy, usually in cases where the logos block is not systematized, made explicit, organized, etc. This is the case, for instance, when we talk about the teacher's practice, as if there was no logos with it. So there's a metonymy. One of the main advantages of using praxeologies is that it does not enclose any kind of value or importance about the considered activity. A theory is just part of a praxeology, as a practice is. They can be more or less developed and explicit, more or less performant or weak. But theoretical knowledge is not of a higher value than practical one. In fact, one cannot exist without the other. As in the previous module, I will finish with some questions that are frequently asked about praxeology. For instance, a methodological problem, how to determine what a technology is, or a theory, a technique, or a type of tasks. For instance, is reasoning a type of task, or modeling, or proving? Are they concrete enough? Are they too general? Another question, the logos block provides a description and a structuring of the elements that compose a praxeology. This is clear when we have a formal activity, especially in a scientific domain, like we have seen with proportionality. But what about less formal human activities with a mainly implicit theory? Where to find the elements and notions to talk about the type of tasks, techniques, technologies, and theories? An example, how to describe teaching praxeologies. Which are the types of tasks, the techniques? Where are they described, agreed on? Where can we find this first description? You will find some pieces of answer in Chevallard's lecture and in some of the papers of the resource folder. I will try to address some of them in the next module about the relationship between praxeologies and cognition. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you soon.